Education choice is often discussed as presenting families an alternative to traditional K-12 schools. But what if the idea of parents empowered with choice for their kids was already embedded into existing public education practices?
It doesn't actually make that much sense that where we go to school is so closely tied to where we live, and whether we live on, the west side or the east side of that street.
On this episode, we sit down with two experts to explore how open enrollment policies that are already on the books actually recognize the value of families having choice in education, and how open enrollment could be improved in Utah and throughout the nation. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and this week I'm excited to talk to two different experts on education policy to expand the conversation around education choice, really talking about different ways to put parents in the driver's seat to help guide the education of their kids, and doing so in such a way that they're working in partnership with teachers, something that we've talked a lot about on this show before and here at Sutherland Institute. So I'm excited to welcome into our virtual studio our two experts today. The first is Halli Faulkner. She's the senior legislative drafter with Yes Every Kid. Halli, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
And also, of course, Christine Cooke Fairbanks, who is our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. Christine, welcome back.
Thank you, Nick.
So I'm excited to talk to both of you because this is an issue, of course, that in recent years has picked up a lot of steam. I mean, there have been many years-long conversations around education choice and charter schools and homeschooling and different models, but especially in recent years, really since the pandemic. Christine, this is something you've written about a lot, that there has been quite an acceleration all across the country of states passing different education choice legislation, advancing in these policy areas. And Halli, you've been involved in this with your role at Yes Every Kid. And I want to kind of elevate the conversation around open enrollment for our audience. Before we jump into that, could I just ask you, just give an overview of Yes Every Kid for our audience who may not be familiar with your organization?
Yeah, so we are an advocacy organization. We're active in most states, but not all. And we, at our core, advocate for policies that empower families and, like you said, can put families in the driver's seat when it comes to choosing the education that works best for their kids.
Thank you. Well, it's, as we've articulated, it's such an important issue because, and this is one of the things I appreciate about Christine's work and writing on this, is there really is this opportunity and need to, again, elevate this idea of the parent-teacher partnership, and that parents and families kind of being the chief arbiters, if you will, of their kids' care and upbringing and education. And that's a principle that we found a lot of resonance with here in Utah as well, which has been really fortunate. So, Halli, I want to ask you, education choice is usually framed as something that's kind of outside the traditional K-12 school model. When people talk about education choice, sometimes it's in the context of, well, parents want alternatives to the traditional K-12 school, and so they look to things like micro schools or homeschooling or charter schools or other private options. Again, a number of which can be great options, and as Christine has articulated well before, should all be viewed as part of the education system. But I want to ask you, this issue specifically, when we're talking about open enrollment, this is actually a way of having the principle of education choice be sort of still part of the traditional K-12 system. And I wonder if you could just expand on that. How do you view open enrollment in the context of the education choice debate?
It's a great question. So, if we look at the two states that I think are have been leaders for a long time in giving families choice, Arizona and Florida, what we see is that in both of those states, almost 10% of their students are attending a public school outside of their zoned boundary, right? And so open enrollment through open enrollment program. Open enrollment is a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to empowering parents with choice. And I like how you frame this idea of like a choice landscape, right? Because in both Arizona and Florida, there's open enrollment, allowing parents to cross school district boundaries. There are charter schools, right? Public charter schools that parents can apply to if they're a good fit for their kiddos. They have education savings accounts, right? For parents who want to use that public funding for their kids to get educated outside of the public school system. There are micro schools, as you imagine. There's support for homeschooling families. And then in this kind of rich choice environment is where we see the entire education landscape really start to thrive. And I know that test scores are certainly not the best way or the only way to measure that kind of thriving, but certainly in Arizona, which has had open enrollment longer than any other state, families across the board from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, from all different economic backgrounds, are seeing their kids learn more year to year than families actually in any other state, if you measure it by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So I think you're right that open enrollment is an important piece of the puzzle, right, when we're talking about choice. And part of the reason it's such an important piece of the puzzle is because in most states, about 90% of families in most states, about 90% of kids attend public school. So if we're looking at choice just outside of that 90%, it's actually kind of myopic. Like we're limiting what's possible. And so open enrollment is one way to dramatically increase the number of choices and options available to families. And because I'm a policy nerd, I will just define quickly open enrollment. For those of you who are new to this concept, open enrollment is simply the idea that any kid who lives in a state should be able to apply to and attend any school in the state.
Christine, I love your take on one of the things I've heard in recent years in education policy debates, specifically when things like Utah's Utah Fits All scholarship comes up as a proposal. I've heard at times some people push back and say, well, you're saying we need education choice, but we've already got charter schools and private schools. And no, we already have open enrollment, so we already have education choice. We don't need these other programs. I'm curious to how you would respond to that. To me, it sounds like kind of a flawed way to, again, pit these things against one another. But what would be your take on that? How do you view these things in sort of a more holistic way?
I agree that Utah does have choice. It has some choices, and a lot of those are working quite well. But I think it's also sort of a concession that choice is a good thing, that we already have what we do, right? We understand that families want charter schools. We understand that sometimes parents want to transfer their kids to a different district school. Sometimes they're looking for homeschool resources or a private school, a way to get to a private school. So if it really is that broad, and the concept of choice is really a principle and not synonymous with a particular public policy, and we have the buy-in that that's a good thing, I would say, why not expand that? Why be hesitant to look at new alternatives and new pathways? Because I think at the end of the day, we can agree that these are good because the focus is on students. Whatever they need, let's find a way to get them there in terms of education or a specific school.
Halli, why should we articulate open enrollment as good? I mean, there's so much, again, debate and discussion. Again, we've had years now of track records of states passing various kind of education choice and scholarship policies. Why do you think open enrollment is something that parents still want? Like, if you were pitching it to someone who wasn't familiar with it, what's the argument that, well, open enrollment existing, expanding, being improved is a good thing for families for this reason? What do you think is the most compelling message?
The nice thing about open enrollment, which makes my job easier, is that it actually polls really well. What we've seen in national polls and state-specific polls is that somewhere between 80 and 85% of people, adults, across all different types of demographics, really support the idea that kids should be able to go to the public school that meets their needs. I think it's kind of a common sense policy in that if their parents are tax-paying citizens in a state, their students should be able to go to a public school that gives them the best education possible. we unfortunately have become used to the idea that in America, we have to pay for our kids to get a good education. You have to either pay for a private school or you have to be able to buy or rent within a certain school district boundary. And, the pandemic, as you mentioned, nudged us to think differently about education and these kind of rigid box that we have put ourselves and our kids in. And when we kind of step back and think logically about it, it doesn't actually make that much sense that where we go to school is so closely tied to where we live. And whether we live on, the west side or the east side of that street, having such a serious impact, right, on the really the rest of our lives. So, open enrollment, I think, is a common sense policy once we kind of pause and step back. But, it's a policy that requires a bit of creative thinking.
I want to toss out some things, maybe by way of playing devil's advocate for a little bit, just to help our audience understand what are some good responses to maybe some questions or potential criticisms of either the creation of or expansion of an open enrollment policy. And the first one that comes to mind, and I'm curious to both of you if this argument has been made at all in open enrollment, but I recall conversations around other education choice programs. Christine, I'm thinking specifically of the the Utah Fits All policy and things like that over the years here and in other states. One of the criticisms you often hear is, well, if this is going to lead to a drain from our public schools, that the families with, the means, the wherewithal will leave, and it will harm the public schools that they are leaving from. Does anyone ever make that argument? One, I think we've dispelled that argument pretty well in those other education choice programs, but does anyone make that argument in open enrollment? In other words, are there any concerns that a lot of families might use open enrollment to leave one particular school and go to nicer schools, more well-funded schools? Does that cause any concern? And if so, what's the right way to address those concerns?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one of the more common questions I get, Christine. I'll be curious to hear if you hear this as well. But there are a couple things that we like to share with stakeholders who are considering creating or expanding open enrollment programs. And one of the things is that the states that create open enrollment or expand open enrollment, they see families start to use open enrollment in kind of a gradual way. So, there's sometimes this fear that you're going to pass open enrollment legislation and there's going to be this tidal wave of families going from District A to District B. And it just doesn't work like that for a couple reasons. Number one, parents are slow to opt into these kind of big changes, right? Having their kid go to school in another district, for example. So they have to learn about the program, then they have to have a friend and who does it, and then their neighbor does it, and then maybe they apply, right? So it's kind of this slow kind of word of mouth process for parents to start using open enrollment. So that's the first thing, right? There's this gradual build that we see over time. And then the second thing that we've been kind of excited to see is that we cannot predict what parents are going to choose. And parents choose schools for all different types of reasons. So the research on open enrollment shows that some parents choose a new school for their kiddos because it's safer, right? They don't get bullied there. Some choose a new school because it's on their commute to work and it's much easier for the family. Some choose a new school because it has a really cool STEM program and their kids obsessed with STEM. So we tend to think that all parents want the same thing, right? All parents in District B must want to go to District A, when actually we see a lot more diversity in parent wants and needs and decision making.
I would say from the Utah perspective, I don't think open enrollment is very controversial. We've had a law for, over 30 years. 1990, right? So I think that open enrollment is, I think it's welcome. I think what kind of is happening on the ground level here is maybe a look at compliance issues and some reforms. So what's already, I would consider a pretty strong law, but also built into, state statute are funding provisions about the funding also going to the school where they're going to go. So I think a lot of that has been anticipated as well. But it certainly doesn't have the same level of energy and opposition as, ESAs or other types of scholarships that have a lot more concern around those sorts of questions about draining public schools and things like that. Obviously, this is a little bit more nuanced because it's within district schools. So.
And Christine, you write in a brand new report for Sutherland Institute all about open enrollment policies and ways to improve them here in Utah. And I want to ask you to talk through some of that report as well, because it sounds like if I were to interpret what you're articulating, the argument would be Utah as a state, by matter of policy, has already said, we like open enrollment, we have open enrollment, we've had it for years and years and years. So now the question becomes, how do we make sure it's executed well? Any kind of overview findings that you want to share from your brand new report that, of course, we'll link to in the show notes for our audience?
Yeah, I would say that, Utah was one of the earlier states to step into open enrollment. And we have a fairly strong law, that says if you have below a certain threshold, you shall accept students into your school. And even beyond that threshold that you can and should be involved in that. A lot of the requirements are put on the local school boards. They have to come up with policies. There are requirements to notify parents of decisions. When it comes to accepting and rejecting students, the statute goes through what can and cannot be considered when accepting and rejecting. I still think there's room for reforms in that. But then also a lot of data reporting requirements, again, at the local level. Again, I think there's a reform at the state level that would make a lot of sense. But just from some perspective as well, the Reason Foundation, they also do these national rankings of open enrollment. They're really useful. And Utah is always rising to the top, right? The most recent one, Utah's one of 5 that got an A, right? They go through these different sorts of things, and only a couple things are missing in terms of just getting total zeros on the categories, having a state level reporting requirement, and having an external appeals process that makes it extra fair. So again, I would say it's a fairly strong law, but that does not mean the work is done. There's a lot of room to improve it, make it extra parent friendly. And certainly in the report, I go into some compliance issues, which we can get into that next or whatever. But there's certainly some space to beef up what's already in the law.
Christine, I do want to ask you about ways, some of the findings and proposals specifically to improve Utah's law. But first, you mentioned something about kind of where Utah ranks nationally. And Halli, what do you see across the nation? I mean, what are some trends that you see in terms of open enrollment policies? Maybe we can try and figure kind of in addition to what Christine said, where Utah fits in the national context. And then Christine will come back to specific improvements we can make. But what's the story on the national level in open enrollment?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because it's a really exciting time for open enrollment. So it's an interesting policy because most states have some kind of open enrollment program on the books. About 43 states have some kind of open enrollment, but usually the programs are pretty weak. They're limited to certain schools or districts or certain families. So not that many families can access it. And of course, any strong open enrollment program is accessible for all families who are residents, and all schools, all districts have to participate. So they're kind of universal in that way. But a couple of states recently over the past few years have passed really strong open enrollment legislation. So Idaho, West Virginia, Kansas have really kind of taken the lead in passing really strong open enrollment programs. And there are thousands of families now in those states who are using the programs. Idaho now has over 20,000 families just in its first year, going to school outside of their attendance boundary or their zoned school. Christine is right. There is, Utah ranks really high nationally in terms of the strength of its open enrollment laws and policies. And so I'm curious to hear, what your recommendations, Christine, for improvement are. I think from, zooming out, just kind of looking at all the policies in comparison, the one thing that Utah doesn't have that those states I mentioned do have, West Virginia, Idaho, Kansas, is that reporting requirement that Christine mentioned. So in a strong open enrollment program, there's kind of two levels of reporting that we like to see. The most important is the capacity reporting for families. So ideally, every school and every district is publishing how many open spaces there are at each school and each grade level. So you take, Johnson Middle School, they have 5 open seats in 6th grade, 17 open seats in 7th grade, 25 open seats in 8th grade, or whatever it is. And they publish that publicly so that families can look at that and easily know, okay, I can, there's space there for my kid or there's not space there for my kid. And then they can decide if they want to apply right across the boundary line. So that's the one kind of reporting that's important, is that capacity, school level capacity reporting. And then the other kind that's important is the more like annual state level reporting. So ideally, all districts annually report, here's the number of open enrollment applications we got, here's the number they accepted, here's the number that were denied, maybe, where the application's coming from. So, we can track the movement right across district boundaries. But I think just maybe you didn't ask me this, so I'm moving out of my lane here. But I think for you, Todd, that data transparency would make a big difference for both families and legislators to really make the most of that program.
Christina, I'd love to jump in more detail on the recommendation side, and maybe I'll frame the question in this way. Just again, give our listeners and viewers a good baseline. If I am the parent of school-age children, and I'm interested in open enrollment, if I want, my kids to go to a different school than in our neighborhood or whatever we're zoned for, currently, how would it work? If I'm just starting out as a parent and I don't know how to pursue this, how does the system work today?
Every district has to create a policy. Part of that is coming up with an application process, application form. So you typically start there. And Hallie's right, they are required to report capacity. And so you should have some of that information up front as you're doing that. This kind of leads into something that we've talked about in the report that I think is also worth mentioning here. So again, so much of the requirements in the state statute lands on local school boards, right? And part of our process and just understanding how this law looks in practice was to search for that, right? Almost as if I were a parent looking for this. And so the good news is all 41 school districts had something, and that's a little generous, but had something on open enrollment or open admissions or something that related to this that a parent could find. But our statute also has a very specific requirement that on the different districts, you have to have like these 7 pieces of data, right? And we just, for internal purposes, called it a capacity report. And it includes like projected enrollment, adjusted capacity, these different things. And what we found was there was just not a lot of compliance with it, right? So there were like 6 school districts that had a full or complete capacity report. There were 15 others that had a partial, right? Meaning we found maybe either one category or maybe most of those categories, but it had kind of a partial report. That means 20, right, didn't have anything, or at least we could not find it. We also did additional outreach and things like that to the districts. So that's almost exactly half that don't have that data available for parents. I'm not saying that report is the end all be all, that maybe it's, the most easily digestible for parents either. But it is kind of a window into what's not available. And I think my first recommendation, and this is certainly outlined in the report, is to make sure that whatever we have on the books already, what we're also getting credit for, by the way, a national ranking score having, is actually implemented in practice, right? We say we do that, but there's a lot of space to improve that. And I think having even an audit at the state level to understand what exists, what doesn't, what the gaps are, I think is really valuable. From there, I completely agree with Halli to have this state level reporting requirement as well, right? Sometimes the data could be a little different, but I think it's also valuable for people to go to one place and see that data rather than 41 different school districts and be looking for this information. Even a state level reporting requirement could grow at some point, maybe to like a one-stop shop sort of information for parents. It could look like a bunch of different reforms or opportunities, but I think those 2 pieces is just really transparency, digestible information, making it user-friendly for parents is really key.
So I agree, Christine, and I'm asking this. I think this is right, but I'm not sure. So in Utah right now, we don't know how many parents are actually using open enrollment, right?
That's right. That is correct. In trying to find that data, even at the district level, if you don't have even half of the reporting, it's hard to put together an estimate. And the state board isn't required to report that. So it is a little tricky.
It would be helpful. I mean, I think that's something, Nick, that does make Utah different than these other kind of states that we think of as like the top players in open enrollment, is that for, Arizona, Florida, Idaho, West Virginia, we know it's publicly reported how many students are using open enrollment, how many families are using it. So I'm like, again, just as a nerd, like I'm curious, like I want to know, what's happening in Utah and who's using the program and how they're using the program. Like I'll be excited once we get that information.
Oh, that was going to be one of my questions. Christine, it sounds like if I'm a parent in Utah, my process of taking advantage of open enrollment that we already have on the books could be wildly different based on the school district I live in. Is that right?
It could be different. I don't know that it would be wildly different. There are some basic requirements in state code. And this isn't to say that the actual process of applying and getting information back is dysfunctional. We've heard from parents saying that it was a fantastic experience for that. It was really easy. Some said it needs improvement. So from a parent perspective, it could be different based on the different districts and their application process, the sort of communication people get back, right? In terms of just data and understanding, I think that's a key piece that for researchers, for legislators, for policymakers would be really helpful too.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to dive into some additional details of this. There's one term of address discrimination that I want to ask you both about and kind of dive into that and have some additional conversation around maybe ways Utah can improve. And again, putting that in the national context of what other states are already doing, are there things maybe we could learn from other states as well to adopt for us here in Utah? So we'll get into all of that right after this quick break. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nick Dunn. Before we get back into the conversation about open enrollment and education policy reform, I want to remind you, if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access this and previous episodes of all of our library of content, as well as short clips of Defending Ideas on a wide variety of topics. And also, if you want to subscribe to Defending Ideas, you can search on any of your favorite platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube. Wherever you like to listen to or watch your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and hit that subscribe button. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to click the little bell icon in the corner, because that'll notify you each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, defendingideas.org for that and much more. Christine and Halli, I want to jump back into what we're talking about, because there are a couple specific areas where you both have articulated some need for reform. The first thing, Halli, I want to ask you, you've written about this concept of address discrimination and maybe a need to have some statutory language to prohibit it. Can you describe what that is and what you think the fix needs to be?
It's a good question. So Idaho was the first and only state to ever pass language that prohibited discrimination against students based on their residential address. That was in 2023 that they passed that language. And we've actually seen that kind of language popping up in open enrollment bills in other states, which we're excited about. And, the idea is that there's all education code in every state has a kind of list of characteristics that districts cannot use to discriminate against a student. So whether or not they have a disability, whatever their religion is, whatever their gender is, whatever their race is, And we are recommending that states also add a student's address, their residential address, to that list. That may seem radical, but we truly envision a boundaryless education landscape. Those kind of rigid school district boundary lines perhaps made sense 50, 60, 70 years ago. But, with the way we are mobile now and, can access more schools, both digitally and in person, it just doesn't make sense to have those same school district boundaries. And it certainly doesn't make sense that, because a kid lives in one zip code, they shouldn't be able to attend a school that meets their learning needs and can perhaps unlock doors that unleash their potential for the rest of their lives. So we're hoping to create a new right for parents and their kiddos to attend, a public school that works best for them if that's what they want to choose.
Can you expand? Either one of you expand a little bit on this concept of address discrimination. Why would a district or a school look at an address and then say, well, let's not admit them under our open enrollment policy?
Well, address discrimination, if you think about it, is kind of the status quo of our school systems in most states. I think it's mostly not nefarious. It's just the way that school districts have done business for lots of decades, right? And lots of generations. It's like if you live in this weirdly designed school boundary, I don't know if you ever looked at like school district boundaries, but there's lots of weird kind of gerrymandering type shapes that happen. If you live in, this kind of weird shape, then you can come to our school. But if you don't, you absolutely can't. And in some states, they even criminalize parents or make it a criminal offense, either a misdemeanor or a felony for parents to send their kids to school across school district boundaries. So I think these are kind of antiquated habits and patterns and policies that we're trying to find our way out of.
Christine, have you seen anything in your research on this issue? Help weigh in addition to what Halli's saying.
Yeah, there are some examples that I also include in the report that have been shared about, I would say they're more subtle forms of even bias, that have been brought up in state board meetings saying, essentially we live in a nice area or rich area and the house prices sort of serve as a check on growth in this area, things like that. So there is still in some ways these I guess more subtle ideas of, hey, we're in a nice area, let's keep it like this, or let's kind of limit how many people come in. Now, I will admit, when this comes up, it's like, we don't do that. That's usually the response. We don't do that. And I believe it. I believe that's a good faith response that education leaders don't seek to exclude students in that way. But just like our law outlines what you can and cannot do, a sort of a preventative measure, say, hey, let's not accept or reject students based on, I was just looking at this again, based on academic achievement, their athletic abilities, whether they are needing special education services, their English language proficiency. I think it makes sense to also bolster that with something like address discrimination, While we definitely believe education leaders are trying to avoid those things anyways, I think it still makes sense to include that in law as well.
You mentioned athletic ability. One question pulling on that thread for a minute. So is that already on the books where a school, I think you said they can't deny or admit someone based on those factors? Does that mean that I guess one of the concerns of open enrollment or an expansion of open enrollment could be if a school is kind of going around to recruit, the fastest kids for their football team or the most talented kids for their softball team or something, and using open enrollment as kind of the freedom to do that. Is there something on the books currently that would prevent that being the variable by which schools decide whether to admit or not admit students under open enrollment?
There is an entity, I'm going to mess up the name and the acronym, but basically there's an association that works on these sorts of questions, and it's also in the law that they'll consult with this group and make decisions based on that to work through these thorny issues about transferring and are you eligible, for varsity and things like that after you do that. So I think that kind of gets into the weeds even below, or even deeper, I should say, beyond even what the statute explicitly outlines. Good questions, very thorny area. But just on the surface, you can't accept or deny a student based on their athletic ability.
Halli, any thoughts either on the athletics point, or I also want to ask you about taxes, because I could see maybe some of the questions being, well, the reason schools are so local as far as their geography is because local property tax is a revenue source for schools. Is based on what you're saying that we need to kind of move away from this idea of being so geographically constrained? Would that have any impact on the way we get tax revenue to fund schools as well?
Yeah, so as you know, every school is funded by a combination of federal, state, and local funding. And the type of funding, and each state also has its own school funding model, which are incredibly complicated, by the way. And so when a state is looking to expand its open enrollment options for families, we like to say that as much money as possible should follow the student. By the way, this is a great policy, money following the student. It's a great policy kind of across the board. So whether you're talking about, education funding or education savings accounts or weighted funding, or, micro school or homeschool funding, or charter school funding, it's kind of considered a best practice for as much money as possible to follow the student wherever they go to school. And the same goes for open enrollment. Now, the devil is definitely in the details when it comes to, this funding question and open enrollment. And so what we like to say, when we're working with legislators or other stakeholders is, if you're committed to open enrollment and really giving families or expanding public school choice for families, we'll work with you on, the fiscal side and do what we can to help make sure and ensure that as much, funding as possible follows the student. Now, in some states that already have a funding formula where a lot of money follows the student, like Rhode Island, for example, it's actually pretty easy, right? You just kind of write open enrollment legislation and you say, like, this student is funded as if they attended school in the district. There are other states where, funding is more localized and it's a little bit more complex to ensure that funding follows the student in open enrollment, but it's nothing that a couple of paragraphs of well-written language, or even just one paragraph of well-written language can't solve.
In the couple of minutes that we have left, Christina, I want to go back to you. And one, is there anything else from your new paper, again, that we'll link to so folks can read it, but is there anything else in there that you thought really stood out as far as things that you found or policy recommendations? So either one, what's just something surprising or interesting that our audience needs to know about that you found in your research? And then two, what do you say to the state legislature? What's kind of the next step as far as how to improve, I guess, the execution of this policy here in Utah?
I would say another recommendation that is in this paper is about transparency of communication to parents. So districts do have to notify parents of the decision for their student if they're getting accepted or rejected, but supplying a reason for a student if they're denied is really useful. And so, obviously Sutherland is very parent focused. We want them to have as much information as possible. I think transparency is just kind of this gold standard that we in America love, and just being really open about what that reason is. Once that's communicated to parents, there's even an element of, can this be reported at some level, making sure that, there's enough students that you're not personally identifying students and the reasons and things like that. But just being really clear about what's going into these decisions, why are students getting denied, and I think that just keeps us away from even concern that something's going on that shouldn't. So that would be kind of the fourth recommendation that's in there. But if I were to say, speaking to legislators or policymakers, beyond all of this, I would say look at this policy through the lens of a parent. What would equip them? what would be just a seamless experience for them. And I think that's where a lot of the reforms will just kind of naturally flow from there.
Halli, we'll give you the last word. Any other thoughts on policy reforms, or broadly speaking, what's next for this issue on the national stage? If you could wave a magic wand, what do you hope to see happen?
Thank you. I'd love a magic wand. I agree with Christine. Like, as long as we're all coming back at the end of the day to what's best for parents and families, I think we'll be moving in the right direction and kind of learning from each other about what that really means and how we do it. A couple states I'm rooting for to pass really amazing open enrollment legislation this session are Alaska. Their governor just rolled out a really impressive education package that includes big open enrollment improvements. And Texas, another state that has really strong open enrollment language moving, and also Missouri. So shout out to all the legislators that hopefully are going to make those improvements happen. And the last thing I'll say is that for anyone who's listening who, is interested in these issues, open enrollment, residential address discrimination. If this has piqued your interest, you're welcome to check out our No More Lines Coalition, which is a group of over 55 organizations now, all from all across the political spectrum that really have this shared interest in eliminating and removing school district boundaries. So, feel free to check out our No More Lines Coalition or reach out to me or anyone on my team to learn more and even join our coalition. You're welcome.
Well, with that, we will end the conversation. Again, thanks very much to Halli Faulkner with Yes Every Kid and Christine Cooke Fairbanks with us here at Sutherland. Appreciate the conversation with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. There are two key principles we should draw from this conversation that I think will help if you or I end up in a discussion about education choice or open enrollment specifically. First, the principle of parents being elevated as the key decision makers directing the care and education of their kids is a pretty common sense principle that should be broadly popular, especially when expressed in the context of parents and teachers being engaged in a partnership, working together to foster high-quality education. Extending this principle to traditional K-12 schools simply makes sense, especially when we recognize that, as Christine pointed out today, Utah has had open enrollment policies on the books for years. And that leads to the second principle. If the state commits to something, we should ensure that the compliance and execution of it is well designed and carried out in a way that benefits students and families. The recommendations found in Christine's new report on open enrollment will help do that. And that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed the discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. And don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.